mind taking over the chair when... Okay.
Good afternoon. I'd like to call this hearing to order. Welcome to the informational hearing on the November Bond Initiative. This is a joint hearing of the Assembly Education Committee, Assembly Higher Education Committee, and the Senate Education Committee. As you know, a $9 billion bond for K-14 facilities has qualified for the November 2016 ballot. This joint hearing is convened to inform the legislature on the specifics of the initiative and to hear different perspectives on the proposed bond. Personally, I have and continue to believe that the state has a role in funding school facilities. I also believe that general obligation bonds are an appropriate source of funding for school facilities across California. I look forward to this conversation, and just from the note of a parent, a teacher, an investment in our schools is an investment in our kids and an investment in the future of California, its educational system, and its economy. So with that, we do have Senator Liu to my left here is with us. Senator Liu, would you like to make a few comments?
Sure. Thank you very much, Assembly Member. Thank you, Assembly Member. So today's hearing does provide us an opportunity to hear from different perspectives and consider public comment by those most interested and affected by the proposed initiative. So it's important that the public be well informed as they consider whether or not to support the kindergarten through community college public education facilities bond, which will be on the November ballot. I hope we provide helpful and valuable information for that purpose today. I also believe that the state has an important role in meeting our school facilities needs, but I also believe that the state and the school facilities community have a responsibility to ensure the efficient and effective use of public resources. In February of last year, the Senate Education Committee held an informational hearing on the K-12 school facilities program. And it was clear that the existing program has served the state of California and our schools communities very well. But it's also clear that there is room for improvement and reform. So I'm interested to hear whether this initiative, the one that's on the ballot, provides any opportunity for that reform to be realized. And as a member of the State Allocation Board, I have been frustrated by the program that is overly complex and bureaucratic. But I also have come to understand the importance of the state's role as our bond resources have essentially been exhausted. So I hope that today's hearing provides some reassurance of the opportunity to meet these needs while using these resources as effectively and efficiently as possible. So I too look forward to hearing the information, and thank you, Assembly Member, and look forward to hearing the testimony.
Great, thank you. And Assembly Member Medina, Chair of the Assembly Higher Education Committee, did you wish to comment?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. It's been nearly 10 years since California last authorized a statewide school bond to build new neighborhood schools and upgrade older classrooms and community college facilities. With roughly 8.3 million students enrolled in K-14 public education, we need to ensure not only their safety, but those of their administrators, teachers, staff, and anyone that steps foot onto any campus or school. As a former teacher, community college, trustee, and school board member, I know that there remains a huge need for our community college and school districts to be able to update many of their facilities, which in many cases are 40 to 50 years old. Today's hearing should provide a good foundation as to the history of K-14 facility funding process. Additionally, I look forward to hearing from our panelists as they share perspectives on the proposed initiative. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon co-chairing the hearing with Assembly Member O'Donnell and Senator Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Medina. Our first presentation is from the Legislative Analyst's Office, who will share an overview of the K-12 and community college funding processes and describe this initiative. Today we have with us Mr. Dan Kaplan and also Jennifer Kuhn. You may proceed when ready.
Thank you. Dan Kaplan with the Ledge Analyst's Office. You should all be have received a copy of our handout entitled Overview of School Facilities Bond Measure. It'll largely coincide with the presentation I'll be giving today. I've been asked to come here today to provide an overview of the November measure and to describe some of the facilities, the school facility programs that the state has. But first, before I move into those areas, let me first discuss my office's role within the initiative process. Compared to how we normally operate in the budget cycle, within the initiative process, we serve the voters. And as such, we do not offer recommendations or opinions on the measure itself, as we normally do through the budget cycle. Our work occurs in two primary stages, the first of which occurs after an initiative is submitted to the Attorney General's office. We summarize the initiative for the Attorney General and summarize its fiscal impacts. And these comments and these thoughts are shared with the canvassers who go throughout the state to solicit signatures. Once the necessary number of signatures are collected and the measure qualifies for the ballot, we then begin the process of crafting the voter guide, which describes the measure, and that is what gets sent out to all Californians who are registered voters. We're currently in the process of crafting this voter guide, and it should go out sometime in early July. So, moving on to how the state goes about funding its long-term infrastructure projects, or larger infrastructure projects. It does so through long-term financing, and the most common way in which it conducts this financing is through the sale of general obligation bonds. The primary reason why the state uses general obligation bonds is they're a relatively inexpensive way of financing larger projects. They require a vote of the people, and once approved by voters, the treasurer can actually go through the process of conducting sales of the bonds. Since 2000, voters have approved nearly just over $100 billion in general obligation bonds. These have funded a variety of projects, such as school construction projects, transportation projects, such as highways, and resource projects, such as state waterways. The state goes through the process of repaying these bonds by paying from funds out of the general fund. So these are non-Proposition 98 dollars. In 2016-17, the governor projects that the state will pay approximately $5.3 billion in general fund dollars, repaying the state's various general obligation bonds. This equates to about 4.5% of general fund spending for 16-17. Though this number has ranged from any given year, from any year over the past decade, from about 4% to a high of 6%. Now, transitioning it on to how the state goes about funding its school facilities. It primarily does this through a state and local partnership. First, I'm going to be discussing the state's role. Since 1998, the state has sold approximately $40 billion in general obligation bonds to fund facility programs. This has been done through 4 separate bond measures, the most recent of which was 2006 Proposition 1D. In 16-17, the governor projects that the state will pay $2.6 billion in debt service for education general obligation bonds for school facility projects, which equates to just over 2% of general fund spending. Now, I want to note that though we have conducted these various bond issuances, the state has essentially exhausted its facility financing. For community colleges, this occurred in 2010. And on the K-12 side, the state effectively exhausted its general obligation bonds in 2012. But I did mention that it is a state and local partnership. And now moving on to the local side, we see that districts and community colleges can both issue local general obligation bonds themselves. These require a 55% vote of the people and are repaid through increasing local property taxes. Since 1998, the state has issued, or voters have approved $95 billion in local general obligation bonds, and $87 billion in these bonds have actually been sold. The other key method of financing available to districts are levying developer fees. The state allows districts to levy these fees on new construction projects, and these funds go to fund new school facilities. Since 1998, approximately $10 billion have been raised through developer fees statewide. There are a variety of other sources of financing available to local governments for raising school facility fees, but these are much less common, such as parcel taxes. Now that I've discussed how revenue is actually generated for these projects, let's move on to how the funding is actually allocated. In 1998, the state created the School Facility Program. And what this program does is to issue per-student grants for construction projects. It generally requires a local contribution, which is 50% for new construction projects and 40% for modernization projects, such that the state is contributing a larger share for modernization projects. However, hardship funding is available for those districts that aren't able to contribute their funding. And these grants can go up to 100% of the construction costs. The general manner in which districts can get funding is to first submit a request to the State Allocation Board, who considers the application and ultimately votes on whether or not to approve of the project. The method that the State Allocation Board chooses to fund projects prior to 2010 was largely done on a first-come, first-served basis. However, as funding began to dry up following 2010, the State Allocation Board began to prioritize those projects that could enter into binding contracts within 90 days of receiving funding. Since 1998, approximately $36 billion in school facility general obligation bonds have been raised, and these have funded a variety of projects, which are highlighted on page 7. The three largest categories are new construction projects, for which $16 billion went, and these are to fund projects such as new facility construction as well as land acquisition. And the second largest being modernization projects, which are to fund upgrades to buildings that are at least 25 years old. And the final is to fund overcrowding relief projects. Throughout the state's history, there have been periods of rapid enrollment growth, which has led to growth in temporary classrooms. So these types of grants were to transition these temporary classrooms into permanent facilities. There have also been other types of projects to create new facilities to reduce class sizes. Now that we've described the K-12, let's move on to community colleges. And we see that this system is far less prescriptive than the state facility program, in that the Chancellor's office has a fair amount of discretion in determining which projects to ultimately bring forth to the legislature for approval. The Chancellor has a number of different priorities they set in establishing which projects to fund, with the top priorities being generally those projects dealing with safety issues. The remaining funding is used to increase instructional capacity and to modernize facilities. In general, projects with larger local matches tend to be prioritized over projects that require more central funding. The governor and the legislature then approve of the projects that are brought forth as part of the Annual Budget Act. Since 1998, approximately $4 billion has been raised, or has been issued through general obligation bonds to fund these community college projects. Now that I provided an overview of the methods in which the state raises funding for school projects as well as issues the funding for school projects, let's turn to the 2016 school bond measure. This measure proposes to allocate $9 billion, 7 of which will go to K-12 entities, with the remaining 2 going to community colleges. Of the 7, $3 billion will go for new construction projects, $3 billion for modernization projects, with the remaining $1 billion split between charter schools and career technical education facilities. We estimate that this will cost the state approximately $17.6 billion to issue this $9 billion in funds. And this is assuming a 5% interest rate over a 35-year repayment period. $9 billion of the $17.5 will be to repay the initial principal, while the remaining $8.5 billion will be for interest payments. This will increase the state's debt service payments by approximately $500 million per year. One of the final things I want to touch on is that this measure specifies the manner in which the funding is actually to be allocated. It specifies on the K-12 side that it is to be allocated in accordance with the school facility program as it existed on January 1st, 2015, while on the Chancellor's office, while on the community college side, it states that the Chancellor's office is able to continue to prioritize which types of projects are to receive funding. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much. Any questions from members? Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you, Senator. I got to make sure my mic's on. It is. First, I'd like to ask a little bit about the hardship funding, and if you can just elaborate on what schools currently qualify for hardship funding and how that process works.
These determinations are ultimately made by the State Allocation Board, but generally a district needs to demonstrate that they've tried to raise funding locally prior to qualifying for the hardship funding. So they might need to demonstrate that they've tried to bring bonds to the ballot but have not been able to qualify. And there are several other ways in which they can demonstrate this.
So if a local community does have a ballot measure, whether it's a partial tax or a local bond measure, and it does pass, but they still don't have the resources, let's say it's an East Bay community in my district where land is extremely expensive and they need to build another high school, is that generally considered a potential candidate for hardship, even if they've demonstrated they've tried and the community has put up some local money, but it still isn't enough?
Well, it really comes down to, I believe, the ability of the local government or the local community to generate funds. So if they have demonstrated that they've tried every means available and still cannot generate the necessary funding, they may be eligible. I do want to say, though, for new construction projects, there are a number of criteria that a school must demonstrate before it can build a new project.
Okay. And for that $7 billion that's in the school facilities bond for K through 12, do you have a sense of what's in the pipeline, what is needed, and if we've seen any studies or measures that there's a demand for well more than that, and this is all that we're going to meet, or how does that compare to what your understanding is of the need based on what's information's out there?
Unfortunately, the state doesn't have great data as to what the statewide need is for new construction projects. The State Allocation Board has approved over $300 million in projects that are awaiting funding, but we don't believe that's an accurate reflection of the true statewide need. There are also a number of projects that are in the pipeline for the State Allocation Board that have not yet been voted on. But again, because funding has been exhausted for several years, it's difficult to assess what the true statewide need is.
Okay. And the final one goes to the local component and developer fees. And are there some circumstances under which communities are able to reach their own agreement with local developers that are outside the framework of when level 2 and level 3 fees, which you haven't commented on, but are there examples in the state of local communities coming up with their own framework outside of what is the baseline for state law?
Currently, the state is at a level. So, to provide a bit of background, there are 3 different levels of developer fees, and currently the state is at a level 2 arrangement. It can move to a level 3, which is when the developer fees can cover 100% of new construction costs. However, prior to doing that, the state needs to demonstrate that they've exhausted all available resources. Now, within the school facility program, there are some small pots of money that are kind of cycling through on a revolving basis. From some projects that are issued, some funding will come back in. So until that funding is completely exhausted, the State Allocation Board will have trouble coming to the determination that statewide funding is completely exhausted. As far as individual examples in which developers can play a larger role locally, there may well be some of those, but our office has not looked into it.
And I just one more indulgence, because I said that was going to be the last one. But it's interesting that you said before that the current bond has been exhausted, but actually it hasn't been exhausted. And that's a bit of a raging debate in my community locally because they're in need of new construction funds. And who gets to decide if it's exhausted?
So, to clarify my comments from earlier, there are small pots, relatively small pots of money earmarked for specific types of projects, such as seismic retrofits. So, if a project were to come through that is seeking to upgrade its facilities to make it more structurally sound in the event of an earthquake, it might qualify for these funding. But however, that funding, it's difficult to use that funding, or there are barriers to using that funding for new construction projects. So, there are some small pots, but by and large, the funding has been exhausted.
So Jennifer Kuhn from the Ledge Analyst, just to clarify, the vast bulk of the $36 billion that's gone to these programs over the last 4 bonds is exhausted. We have this few $100 million left, and we will for a number of years because we have this process as a state of projects can return money if there's any problem. Ultimately, they're not able to proceed forward. So we're constantly taking in little streams of money and reissuing for the next project on the list. But the vast majority of the money is gone.
And does the State Allocation Board have the authority to say, even though this revolving door is happening, we are de facto exhausted?
The state, I don't think, makes a, yeah, in terms of the actual determination of when someone will say they're exhausted and the higher level of developer fees will be initiated, I assume it is in the board's purview.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Hertzberg?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Does your office, you're looking forward, but in terms of the previous questions by Assemblywoman Baker, the question I wanted to know is looking back. In fact, $36 billion has been spent over these 4 bond issues, together with the $95 billion of the various districts. Do we have any historical perspective with respect to how effectively that money was used? And in 2 contexts, I would ask, because we're trying to serve 2 public policy purposes with this money, as you know. One is to build schools that have a significant need. What impact has that had? And 2, we're trying to enhance the construction of housing because we're relieving these developer fees and the various court cases and the likes which led to these bond issues some years ago. So I wanted to know if you had any homework with respect to looking back and to determine how effective this was, both with respect to the housing issue and with respect to the impact on schools and what we've actually done with this money.
Well, the table I did highlight on page 7 does describe how the funding was ultimately spent. So we do know the funding went out.
I know that.
I guess if I could get a little more clarity as far as what...
The state effectively does no review to see somehow if the state has these rules that for this program are very straightforward. If you have an enrollment projection that shows that your existing space isn't enough to house them, you qualify for a grant of a certain amount. You build the building. We have rules for, as a state, when we audit, to make sure the building was constructed to state code standards as well as to house the number of students that were authorized. So the state checks that from a compliance perspective, those needs were filled. If you had an old building, you qualified for modernization, you wanted to renovate it, the state checks that you're making appropriate renovations. So the question often before the state is, okay, so now what? How much need is remaining? And that's based largely on what our enrollment projections. K-12 enrollment projections over the next few years are largely flat. It's been about flat for a number of years, almost a decade. This is preceding a former decade of lots of growth where there was far greater need for new facilities. But buildings are aging, and so one thing before the state is how many buildings are 25 years or older are going to get to the stage where they need to be replaced. But we don't have a state inventory. We've got 10,000 school sites. We don't know as a state how many have crossed that barrier. We also don't know all these local practices. How well have they been maintained? Will they actually last 35 years? The challenge before you is quite great in terms of actually sizing the bond going forward. You didn't actually size this one. The field sized it for you. But we struggle every time you have a bond about just how much outstanding need there is.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get to, I'm a taxpayer. I'm spending money, government money, to solve a problem. And what you just told me in terms of the diagnostic here is, did we really solve the problem? We heard many years ago the stories of dilapidated schools and how horrible the impact on kids were. And we're trying to understand if we've, beyond that, you said, okay, we've done a homework that said we've built the building, that it's met its code standards, but do we have any homework at all to determine how much impact we've really had with all this money? Both on the housing side, do you have any homework on the housing side? Because the notion was that this was creating a chilling effect on the ability of people in the housing business to actually build because the cost of developer fees. We talk about a housing crisis in California? Do we have any homework for us to make a determination as to whether or not this was wise, intelligent policy, and did it do what it was supposed to do? Where did it achieve it? Do we have any benchmarks, any ability beyond the fact that we built the building and, we had an enrollment record? I don't know how to ask that question, but it seems to me that it's a fair question as we go forward. When we spent so much money, I don't think there was a construction process in the history of the states involving schools this long, with the $40 billion from the states and $95 billion from the locals. Any insights at all on that?
The state to date has not done that sort of exploration, and it would just take some thinking, presumably among the legislature, apart from just strict compliance. What were your keen interests? Was it effect on housing, on local other development outside of housing? But to date, the state has not taken that more sort of multidimensional approach to understanding performance of school facilities. It could moving forward.
There is Senator Hertzberg on the local level. Local bonds, there usually is an advisory committee to watch over, what the district has decided to do, articulate and monitor the spending for the development of a school and that kind of thing. But the state, by and large, does not interfere with the local.
I guess what I'm trying to get to, Madam Chair, is a different question. I know the BB committee in Los Angeles and some of the other committees, those were whether or not government wasted dollars, right? Did we spend the money appropriately? Did we meet budget? Were we on deadline? That's one side of the issue. The other side of the issue that we were faced with, and we were working on these things many years ago, a number of these bonds were mine that I had authored, was this larger question about whether or, first of all, we're taking non-98 dollars. And the old rule, you had property tax that built schools. Now we're taking dollars outside of 98 in the general fund and adding this to say we're going to pay for school facilities that were paid for under 98. Fine, fair call. We also said we have a crisis in housing, and the question is, it doesn't seem like there was any diagnostic. Did we actually solve the problem? We may have built a school, but is there a larger view of the picture as a state perspective when we spent $40 billion to achieve the deliverables? That's all I was asking.
That's a fair question. I have just a curious question. Does the language in the initiative provide any flexibility to modify the existing program?